Hello, everybody. Welcome back. I'm Mike Wiest here to introduce our afternoon speakers. When you're ready, please welcome our first speaker, Sabine Kastner.
Good afternoon. So I will represent the rhythms in this group, which is a quite interesting mix, I think, of different sciences. Now, my theory that I'm going to present today to you is very much grounded in empirical science. And I'm a neuroscientist, and so you will learn about quite a bit of neuroscience, and just bear with me. I hope I can get you through this. But we'll start in a different place. We'll start in the world of art, and this is a painting of one of my favorite artists, René Magritte. And I love Magritte's art so much because, to me, it encapsulates the experience of visual perception, and I'm a vision scientist by training. Now, what we're looking at here is the canvas that the artist left at the end of the day in front of a window. And we are making all kinds of assumptions about what is in that occluded space behind the canvas. And many of you will say, well, it is exactly what was captured on the canvas during the day's work of the artist. But there is really little that would support this hypothesis. Now, there could be something completely different behind that canvas. There could be a flock of sheep, there could be a mountain scene, whatever else. But what it shows us is that vision is this back and forth between some kind of physical clues that we take from the environment, and we combine them with our predictions that are based on our individual experiences of how we would like this environment to look like. And this dimension of visual experience has a very deep philosophical dimension and direction. And Magritte was very, very well aware of this when he termed this painting the human condition. Now, what I'm going to talk today about is how we select information in the visual domain from kind of cluttered scenes like this Magritte painting. And one way to do that is to recruit a spatial selection mechanism. Some people would refer to it as spatial selective attention. So that's my definition for today of what I'm going to talk about. And this spatial selection mechanism is referred to in our textbooks as a focus of attention or window of attention, a spotlight of attention. It has a lot of different metaphors. But what it characterizes is that it operates over a relatively small visual space, and everything that falls into this spotlight is processed in the brain in an enhanced way. So it gets some kind of preferential treatment. Now, what we can do with the spotlight of attention to extract information from the environment is we can move it dynamically around to new locations. And we can do that either in what we call overt attention way, which means we move our eyes along with the spotlight. That can happen about 4 times per second, actually. Or we can do it in a covert way. That means we will fix our gaze somewhere, let's say here, and then we move the spotlight around the scene. You do that when you spy on people. Probably you spy on someone in this way right now who sits next to you. That person will not know that because you're not moving your eyes to give clues. You do that all the time when you're driving a car, when you monitor the periphery actually of your visual field to make sure that there's nothing that comes at you that you need to react to. This covert attention is very, very efficient. You can move your covert spotlight of attention around the visual scene at a rate of about 20 hertz, so every 50 milliseconds or so. And I will basically talk speak in my talk today about the neural basis of this covert spotlight of attention. The goal is whatever you use, whether you overtly or covertly search the scene in front of you, You want to basically extract the information to reconstruct that scene in some kind of faithful way. Now, when we allocate the spotlight of attention somewhere in the scene, so you may allocate yours right now on my slides, or on me, or on your cell phone, whatever you do right now and where your focus of attention is, what you subjectively perceive is that you take in the information continuously. And what I want to show you today, and this is what will lead us to this rhythmic theory of attention, is that this is just a very, very big illusion. What really happens is that the spotlight in reality blinks, so it goes through these phases where we take in more information, and that alternates with a phase where or a state, an attentional state, where we take in less information. And these states, as you will see, are very rapid alternations. So we are looking at a very, very dynamic function that changes over time, as I think all cognition does. Okay, so let's take a starting point now to look at this in greater detail. So I want to start by showing you what happens during a spatial selection of the type that I demonstrated with the Magritte painting in the human brain. Now here we're looking at a hemisphere, a right hemisphere. It's kind of a bird's eye view. This is the posterior pole, and this is the frontal pole. And we took here a structural image and we inflated it with some, fancy piece of software so that we can actually look into the gyri here that are opened up. So what I will play for you is this activity that unfolds in the brain while we are making spatial selections. So you see here first the buildup of activity. These are functional magnetic resonance imaging signals from one participant over the occipital pole. So that's where the visual system is located in the primate brain. And then you see this buildup later on of activity along here, the parietal cortex, the interparietal sulcus, and there are also frontal sides that you cannot appreciate in this view, and there are many subcortical regions that are also engaged doing something very simple like a spatial selection from the environment that we do all the time. So what I would like you to appreciate here is what a vast network, it's about a third of the primate brain that will be engaged in something simple like that. And what we try to understand is how this network basically is organized and is coordinated to reach, these kinds of selections in this efficient way. Okay, but I want to, again, before I get into that, take a little bit of a different starting point. And I want to show you what happens when this attention network that I've just shown you is insulted, when damage to it occurs. And we can look here at, so this is a schematic, it's a lateral view of the brain. Here's frontal cortex, parietal cortex, and in this look-through, it's actually an old brain region that's buried underneath the cortex. It's the thalamus. And I just picked these three examples here, so anyone, if any of these key nodes are damaged by a stroke or some other insult to the brain, a very, very profound consequence occurs behaviorally. And that is shown here, I think, in one of the most dramatic ways that it can be captured. So here, a painter, Anton Rederscheid, who had a stroke to his right parietal cortex, was encouraged to draw these self-portraits at regular intervals after his stroke. And we are looking here at 1 year after this tragedy happened to this painter. Now, you see after 3 months that the left-hand side of his visual space is gone. This patient cannot direct attention to it and cannot perceive anything from that space. It's the most dramatic thing that you can ever see, actually, I think, or one of the most dramatic things as a neurologist. the concept of that left visual space is gone from that painter's mind. That is also true, in a large extent, after 6 months. We see here that all what he perceives is kind of crammed in this right-hand space that is still intact. And then you see that over time, the left-hand space does recover, and thankfully this is the typical outcome of what we call visual spatial hemi-neglect. So this network is able to somehow recover function, and after 1 year, these patients are typically quite good with their attention function. But it shows you that an insult to this network can have these really dramatic implications, particularly to our conscious perception of anything that goes on in this space. Okay, so let's get back to the rhythms and to this blinking spotlight of attention. So I want to tell you a little bit about how we study that in my laboratory. So we study 2 different primate brain models, the human brain and the monkey brain. And we use behavior to glue these 2 brains together. So typically we will start with a very, very well understood laboratory task from human cognitive psychology. And we will try to train monkeys on that. And since they're very smart, we are typically successful. And then we can use these behavioral patterns that are very similar across the 2 primate brains to link them to the neurosignals that are mainly from electrophysiology and what we call intracranial electrophysiology. So these are direct recordings from the brain. We do that in the human brain as well. We have sometimes the privilege to have patients who are implanted with electrodes agree to do these tasks, and then we get direct recordings from the human brain. These are mainly epilepsy patients that was introduced to you yesterday, I think, in one of the talks. Keep in mind that these are diagnostic procedures, so there's no scientific goal here. Okay. Now, let me start with the behavior. That is, as I said, always our starting point, and it's a goal to explain attention behavior. So the task that we are using here is what's called an Egli-Driver task. It was introduced by Egli and Driver when they were working at Berkeley in the early 90s. And here's how this task goes. There's never a shift of eye movements or a shift of gaze, so no eye movements here. Our participants are fixating here in the middle. And then we present these 2 bar-shaped objects here. They can be oriented vertically or horizontally. That will change from trial to trial. Then we'll present a spatial cue that will draw attention to that location in space very briefly in one of the 4 corners. So this is just one example here, and it's unpredictable where attention will be drawn from trial to trial. And then there is a longer period in between before a target appears with high probability in that cued location where attention is allocated. This is at threshold, so it's very, very dim. It's much dimmer than what you see here in the schematic. Now, the interesting period for us is this one over here. There's no transient in the environment. There's just this direction of attention to that visual space, and then an unpredictable time until the target will occur. So we think about this period as a relatively well-defined cognitive state where there's no further input from the sensory environment or anything else. Now, if behavior was basically steady over time, we would assume that it's independent of that dimension of time. So at any point in time here, whether the target is shown after 300 milliseconds or after 1.5 seconds, the behavioral performance should be approximately the same. But that is not true. And that is shown here. So here we plot the behavior of our human participants as a function of this interval. Here we call it the cue target interval, or delay period, whatever you want to call it. So we plot this time here and then the change in performance on the y-axis. You see right away that there is a huge fluctuation in performance over time. So if you were to do this task right now, I could tell you exactly when you're good at it and when you're not so good at it. So here at about 400 milliseconds into this Q-target interval, you're about 6% or so at threshold better to make these detections than 120 milliseconds later when you're in this trough here and then you go back to a peak and so on and so forth. So there's a behavioral rhythm at work here, and this behavioral rhythm goes at about in the range of 4 to 6 hertz. This is a group here, so there's some individual variability. Now, the interesting thing is that our non-human primates also have these behavioral rhythms in this task, and they go at the approximately same rate. So here we have an example for a feature of attention function that had been overlooked for a really long time in our field, that is conserved in evolution for about 20 million years. This is how far we go back with that particular species that we typically study in our laboratories. Now, this made, of course, the neurobasis of this all the more interesting for us. So let me just briefly summarize this part of my talk. I've shown you that there are behavioral rhythms at 4 to 6 hertz that occur during visual spatial attention, and this is not specific to this task. You can measure that in any spatial selection task that you probe or that has been probed to date. And these behavioral rhythms seem to set up alternate states of better or worse performance. And this rhythmic property of attention is preserved throughout primate evolution. Why has it been missed? Because I think we as scientists have a lot of limitations, and one is that we tend to average over time in our studies, and we never look at the dimension, or almost never look at the dimension of time. So whoever is a cognitive scientist in this room, I would like to encourage you to look at that dimension of time, because it may hold some interesting surprises. Now let's look at the neurobasis of this function. I want to show you a direct recording from the human brain. And this was recorded from parietal cortex, and it's just a single trial in this ugly driver task. So here again is the schematic of this task, and here is what we call the high-frequency broadband activity at this location. I will put you through this in a moment. You can think about this signal as some kind of population average of thousands of neurons that are underlying this recording site. So these recording electrodes are quite coarse. They collect signals from a large number of underlying neurons. Now, what we're looking at here is activity that's evoked by the cue onset. Again, the cue directs attention, to that location, and then typically attention will just linger there. And then here's the beginning of this delay, or the cue target interval, and it ends basically here when we present that dim target. And here, at this point, the patient is making manual response, a button press, indicating the detection of the target. Now, the interesting period here, what's happening, the most interesting thing that's happening in this trial is here. During that cue target interval, again, there is no input from the sensory environment. There's just a cognitive state, this allocation of attention in space. And you see right away that these signals are fluctuating here. They are not steady. They have some kind of temporal dynamic. And this is exactly what we saw, as you remember, these behavioral rhythms. And we see these kinds of fluctuations in each trial. So it's not that I just found one trial that I want to share here with you. So here are a few other examples from the same patient and the same recording site. So the first question is, what is the frequency of modulation of this signal here? What is the frequency of that neurorhythm? And it goes at 4 hertz. We often call that a theta rhythm. Now, we have a 4 hertz rhythm as a behavioral rhythm, and we have a neurorhythm that goes at approximately the same frequency, but that does not mean that these have anything in common. So this could be a coincidence when you're recording, whether you do EEG studies or any other studies from the human brain or the primate brain, you get a lot of these slow oscillatory rhythms. So they could mean all kinds of other things. So we wanted to see whether we can link this signal, this theta rhythm, in some ways closer to make a prediction, a direct prediction, probabilistically about behavioral outcome. And what we ended up was looking at the time when the target occurs, so that would be here, relative to the phase of that theta rhythm that it is in at that point. So here, you see that the rhythm is basically at a peak, right? And in this trial, that's also true. But in this trial, where the patient actually misses the target, we see that this theta rhythm is in a trough. Now, when you do this now systematically, you basically get a profile like this. So this is your theta phase here. This is one theta cycle, and this is the change in hit rate or the change in performance. And you see clearly that there is one phase, this one over here, where performance is much, much better than at the opposite phase. So now you can basically use this signal, the theta phase, to make a direct prediction about behavioral outcome. And now you can link behavior and neural signals in really elegant ways. What you can find then is that, I should go back here to the monkey brain, we recorded here in parietal cortex and frontal cortex and in the thalamus from the monkey brain, and we see these kinds of relationships between behavior and theta phase. We call them phase detection relationships. And we see them, of course, also in the human brain. In the human brain, we are recording from many, many sites, so we are recording from a network. And that way we can also appreciate the topography of these phase detection relationships. So they don't have a seat in our brains. They're a property of an entire network. So everything that is here in these red colors are very strong phase detection relationships similar to these ones. Everything that is shallow will not be a site where you find these relationships between neural signals and behavior. Now, in the human brain, we were able to make another really, really interesting discovery. So what we did in this analysis here is we took the strongest phase detection relationship that we found, it's actually this one down here, in parietal cortex, and then correlated all the other ones and all the other recording sites with it. And when you do that, you get a very, very clear dissociation between frontal and parietal cortex. So these are very, very classical parts of the primate attention network. And everything in between, that somato-motor cortex, is an antiphase. It means that it's also predictive of behavior, but it's predictive of poor performance. And that was quite stunning to us, and we followed up on that, and we collected a lot of data in non-human primates to arrive at this interpretation. So you have to just take my word for it. That was the version number 1 of this rhythmic selective attention theory. And basically what the theory proposes is what these behavioral rhythms and the neural rhythms that go with them, what they do is they set this entire network into 2 different states. One state is what we call a more sensory emphasized state. This is a state where we perform better and where we can take in more information from the environment. And that alternates with a state that's a more motor emphasized state. During that state, we can execute a motor action. We can move our eyes to a new location in the visual environment that interests us, or do anything else. So why do these states alternate all the time? What is the benefit of that? We think the benefit is that it gives us the greatest flexibility for this cognitive function. So rather than driving the network into one state and then get out of that state and get to another state, if you want to shift attention to somewhere else or get up and walk out of the room to go to the bathroom or whatever else you want to do in terms of action, you can do it on the fly. You do not have to set up a new state. That state comes for free every 250 milliseconds, 4 times per second. So that's our interpretation of why we have that, and I could go into much greater detail, but I want to get to the version 2 and how we extended this theory during the last years. But let me summarize what we have thus far. I've shown you that attention function unfolds over time and has rhythmic properties. Theta rhythms organize subnetworks. So here, sensory and motor networks, that's what I've shown you, into alternating states. And theta phase predicts both perceptual and motor performance. Now, where do we go from here? We think actually that this theta rhythm that we see so prominently in the attention network is much more than just an important rhythm for that network. It is a rhythm that coordinates a lot of other cognition and a lot of other networks, and thereby this attention rhythm basically provides a scaffold for the rest of cognition. So that's the idea here. If you think about attention function, it is the most basic cognitive function. You cannot do cognitively anything, I think, without attention function. Or not much, at least. Let's just not be too drastic here. And so you bring in this attention network to do other cognition, and this comes with this theta rhythm. And then this theta rhythm can be that scaffold to coordinate the rest of these cognitive networks that you want to bring in. And if I have the time for that, I want to give you a couple of examples. So one example is shown here, and that is the coordination of interactions of the cortex and the thalamus. And they are very, very important for the coordination of the attention network. And so I want to give you this kind of throughput here. This is the thalamus. I don't know if you have at this conference a talk on the central median nucleus, which is really important for consciousness. We are looking here at another interesting nucleus. It's this one back here. It's called the pulvinar. And this nucleus receives input exclusively from the cortex and sends back signals. And it sets up a gazillion of loops with cortex. So they are shown here in this schematic. So you can think about that cortical regions, they all kind of loop through the thalamus, through the pulvinar. And we knew that anatomically since the 1980s, but we never really knew what the function was. And one function that we have discovered, I think there will be many, many more, is that this pulvinar can basically act as a hub to coordinate and synchronize population activity across a cortical network that gets engaged, like the attention network. And that gets to a very profound question in neuroscience, and that is the question how brain areas, cortical brain areas, are actually communicating. And I just want to give you some of these ideas behind that in schematics here. So when we look at, we are looking at these two nodes here in parietal cortex and in frontal cortex. And so we are looking at spiking activity. So that is what area A wants to get to area B. How can that happen? One way to do that is by, let's just step one back. So when we look at area A, what we observe is actually, when we look at the slow oscillatory activity that's going on in the population in area A, that the spiking activity does not occur randomly, but it occurs at certain phases. Here it would be the peak of the phase of that slow oscillation in area A. So basically, that oscillation sets up, if you like, some kind of excitable state for that area. Now, if the spiking activity here should get to area B, the best way is to synchronize that slow oscillation between area A and B, so to align it in time. And then whenever a spike arrives in area B, you would have this kind of excitable state. This would be opposed to when they're out of sync, like in this example, very little spiking activity can materialize, so very little information can be transmitted. And what the pulvinar is doing is synchronizing this slow oscillatory activity between these two regions. And typically that's done in a slightly higher frequency band than our theta rhythm that characterizes the attention network. These are so-called alpha oscillations between 10 and 15 hertz. And the pulvinar is doing this synchronization not only for these two regions, but it's doing it across the entire network that gets recruited, and this is why it's such an important hub. It's actually right now a target for interventions in schizophrenia patients because of this kind of hub function. Now, this is one example. So now this theta, so the slower oscillation, this 4 hertz theta rhythm, is actually coordinating this oscillation that I've just shown you between this cortical, or all these cortical nodes that the pulvinar is doing, and it co-occurs with a sensory emphasized state. So it's basically a gating of this cortical network that's associated with that. So the theta rhythm is controlling this kind of interaction that the thalamus has with the cortex. Now I want to give you one other example that's speculative, but we can work on it and we can probe this as a viable hypothesis, and that comes from memory systems. So what memory systems are doing is, just in a nutshell, are two main things. They're storing information, that's called encoding, or they recall information, that's called retrieval. The way this works, just in a nutshell, is that during the encoding process, information goes through kind of a gate that memory systems have. It's called entorhinal cortex, so basically sensory regions, for instance, would forward information that has been taken in to entorhinal cortex, and from there it will get into the hippocampus and subdivisions of it, and the information flow is the way it is shown. What happens during retrieval is basically the opposite. Information from the hippocampus will get reinstated, then goes through entorhinal cortex and get back to the sensory perception systems to basically lead to that recall of the information. Now, if you think about the problem, it is huge. Encoding and retrieval should never happen at the same time, because if it does, we will form a false memory. We will try to store new information with an old information, right? And this may get mixed up and lead to something interesting, but also something that the system wants to avoid, obviously. And the way the system does that is simple. It's using a 4 hertz theta rhythm and associates the encoding of information and the retrieval of information with opposite phases. So basically, the real model from which I took this is a little bit more complicated, but I think I gave you the gist of the neuroscience here. So basically, the proposal is, again, that this attention rhythm that we see in this frontoparietal network could basically coordinate this process in the memory systems. So in this proposal, the encoding of information would be associated with what I called earlier sensory emphasized state, and the retrieval with the opposite phase. So this same rhythm could basically serve many, many different functions for different networks, and that way it could serve as this kind of scaffold. Now, I want to just add this to my summary here, the last 2 points, what I just told you about. Lots of this is speculative and will need a lot of empirical evidence. Theta rhythms organize functional interactions between pulvinar and cortex. That is very, very well now, I think, established, so that does not have a question mark, but the next one has, and that is theta rhythms may serve as a mechanism to coordinate neuronal populations across cognitive large-scale networks with attention function serving as a scaffold. And probably that explains why when attention function fails, as I have shown you with this example of Rederscheid, the painter who suffered from visual spatial neglect, why this is such a profound condition. And with that, I want to introduce you to my band of collaborators. So some of you, the older in the audience, know where this is coming from. The younger ones will wonder about it. But each of the original faces have been replaced by a collaborator. And this is still a growing band. Thank you.
Thank you for a beautiful presentation. I just wanted to ask you, when we were talking of this, since we are talking of visual experience being a qualia, this thalamocortical radiations, particularly from the pulvinar, do you think they could contribute in a large way in addition to this rhythmic attention? There's a affective component also which adds to the qualia. So could this thalamocortical radiation contribute to the concept of qualia of a visual experience?
It's a great question. I don't know whether it could or not. That needs to be tested. But I can tell you about one thing that is, I think, relatively well established in rodents, not so much in primates. And what this part of the thalamus seems to do is to amplify noisy signals from the cortex. So, some of these signals that you're referring to could be extremely noisy, but since they may come from different cortical regions and they all converge on the same set of neurons, these neurons can amplify them and then send basically that amplification back to cortex. So that could be a way, I think, at least in principle, to serve such a function.
Thank you. There.
So I was kind of curious. So have you seen any variability in those with like ADHD or like high internet use or like any differences? Or do you think it's more of like an fundamental system that isn't necessarily impacted by like disorders and like other like more like external functions?
This is a great question. Thank you for that. And I want to just go back very, very briefly actually to the model, if I can find it, because let's take this one here. So this part of the model. So we are looking at ADHD right now, just at the behavioral level. But basically, we think about these alternating states when it comes to ADHD as the two extremes of that spectrum. So ADHD is a huge spectrum disorder. And you have in that spectrum two extremes. One we call hyperfocused kids. So these kids they don't really have an issue with their attentional focus. They can focus on playing chess for hours. But you will never get them to the dinner table. So their problem is with switching, right? And this is switching here. This is the alternation, right? It allows you to switch quickly to something new if you need to do that. And on the other, so we basically think about these kids that they are locked into this kind of sensory emphasized state. The whole network is locked into that. It's not doing this alternation. And then on the other end of that spectrum, you have hyperactive kids. So these kids, we think about them as locked into this kind of motor emphasized state where they go from one activity to the next. But they can never find, enough focus to go deeper. We don't know whether that's true. But if it was, I think it would give us a whole new view on ADHD and how to help these kids. Because what would help them is to reinstate these rhythms. And it's not hard to do, to entrain rhythms in a brain. You can do that very, very easily. Actually, all of your brains right now are entrained in your language system at about 4 hertz due to my speech. This is the envelope of typical speech. So that is, how we can entrain brains. So it would, I think, offer a lot of new perspectives on interventions. And so we are looking at that, but I do not have an answer yet for you, but that's a really, really important question. Thank you for that.
question over here.
I have a frivolous question. When it comes to certain sports, reaction time is really important, like in baseball, or responding to a starting gun in track. And so if your attention is lagging and waxing and waning, is there like an optimum strategy for approaching batting, when to start looking at the pitcher and waiting for the ball, or when to start paying attention to the starting gun?
It's another really great question. And again, we have not looked at athletes, would be very, very interesting. But you would have to look at them under those conditions. And that is where we need to go, I think, in the field to really, I don't know how to do it, but have caps for these athletes while they're doing all of this and be able to get reliable measures from their brain. That's still, a hard thing to do. But I have a very clear hypothesis here that we could test, and that is that this rhythm probably gets a lot faster. So you basically switch back and forth a lot faster to just basically optimize that you get off the ground after your starting signal right away. That would be my prediction, but that is something that one could test very concretely.
Yeah, in track lore, there's a kind of a myth that there's an optimum time for the starter to hold the sprinters before they start losing attention. And so if you get them within the right window, they'll get a good start. Otherwise,
yeah, and so what this may indicate, and thank you for that, because I didn't know that, is if you speed up that rhythm, you can probably do that for a while, but you cannot do that permanently. So the system will always go back into this kind of slower, condition that I introduced to you today. So that is kind of the default state, if you like, for that network. But if you need to, you can speed up that rhythm.
Is there one more?
Can you apply your model also to piano playing? They have to look at the sheet and then play, and it's really difficult to synchronize this looking at the sheet and finding the right finger to push the taste.
Yeah, so that's another real great experiment that I would love to do, particularly not so much in people who struggle with learning, but in a professional musician, right? What happens to this network? How does it function with somebody who can do that so seamlessly and so perfect? And it could be that these mechanisms are not in place or they change completely. But I would not make an assumption necessarily that, they are always the way, I portrayed that today, particularly in these kind of very specialized and high-trained populations. But it could explain probably some of the trouble that people have learning.
Okay, I think we'll go on now, but we hope to save 10 minutes or so at the end for discussion with all the speakers. Let's thank Dr. Kastner again. And next, please welcome Naotsugu Tsuchiya.
Nothing. Wait a sec. I think screen mirroring is the opposite right now. Can you swap the screen? Okay, sorry. It was working before. So if I move it like this. All right. Thank you. All right. Thank you for inviting me to this fantastic event. I was here in 2016, actually in Tucson, and I gave a talk on the prospect of the integrated information theory at the time. And today I'm going to talk about this question that came up several times in the conference. Is my red? You are red, right? So by the way, if you take a picture of this first slide, you get this QR code for the top right, and you don't need to, that will lead to the link to the slide overall. So you don't need to take a picture at each of the slides. And by the way, if you are interested in the talk content, then the more technical or full version of the thing is described in the paper. That's also a link through this QR code. And that's also going to have more, that was actually accepted today, this morning as well. Thank you. All right. So before starting my talk, I want to first ask your experience or thought. If you have an iPhone or the phone, a smartphone or computer, then if you can scan this QR code top right, you can participate in this query right now online. And also, if you have a laptop, then slido.com, and then type in this number, 3149-365, you can participate in this. And I have a couple of questions like this today, so if you join this right now, that would be great. So the question I want to ask right now is that before coming to this conference, okay? Have you ever wondered if your red is the same red as my red? Assuming that I am color typical, and also you're also color typical. And if you're not color typical, that's also fine. But let's see what we got. And so this is a kind of the philosophical question, right? And I want to basically address this question in a scientific manner, but we'll see how it goes. This conference has a lot of audience that may be very difficult to deal with from the philosophical kind of background. Oh, it's great that it's increasing 109. Okay. Okay, maybe I'll just go to the poll results. Oh, it's still increasing. Okay. Oh, great. I can't really stop it. Hopefully there's no zombie today. Okay, let's stop here. Okay, so within this audience, I'm happy to hear that roughly like 87% of the people have ever thought about your red is the same as other people's red. So this is presumably the reason why you came to this consciousness conference, to find out your qualia, right? And then, in fact, this is just not about the color. Somebody today in the symposium talked about the happiness ranking of the Finland was fast right now, right? But what does it mean actually? Is my happiness living in Australia right now same as your happiness living in Spain? I don't understand this question. And also, colorblind people experiencing red in the same way as the color typical do. But what about animals? Do they experience qualia in particular modality in the same way as we do or not? How about insects or plants? When you're talking about panpsychism or idealism, you need to answer this kind of question, not just saying that, oh, plants are conscious or not. Plants should be experiencing something if they are experiencing something in some particular way, I think. And also, when you talk about AI consciousness, is the more important question is that, can AI experience a red in the same way as we do, right? Somebody may claim that, oh, my AI is now already conscious. And I've seen some kind of presentation like this yesterday and 2 days ago. But exactly how they are conscious is unclear if you don't know this question. And in the end, it boils down to this question: can science address these questions? So my talk outline is as follows. I give a first background, is my red, your red, and then qualia structure paradigm to introduce this, crack to this problem. And then I go to empirical research examples and then future outlook if I have time. So the background. When I talk about qualia, by the way, this t-shirt is from my project. Somebody asked if it's sold, but it's not sold, actually. The qualia means phenomenal consciousness, subjective experience, contents of consciousness, qualitative aspects of consciousness, feelings, what it is like. Inclusively and also roughly speaking, what you are conscious of. Okay, but this may sometimes be a bit too vague or too fluffy for some people to agree on. So I'll give you two things. One is that the non-qualia. What is not qualia? At the first stage, if you're just forget about your philosophical commitment of the panpsychism or idealism or quantum microtubulist or something like that. Anything that you do not directly experience is non-qualia. Brain, rhythm, attention, I'm sorry, it's not qualia directly, as long as you do not experience that. Okay? Thought could be qualia, cognition could be qualia, but it may not be all the time. And also, sometimes people talk about qualia in different sense, especially in narrower or broader sense. So, for example, when you see this nice picture of the sunset, some people may say, oh, this is the kind of the qualia that you have. Vivid, emotional, entire, experience. But this is one definition of a qualia in the broadest sense. Qualia in the broadest sense means that whatever you experience in one moment of experience. That's the qualia, but in the broadest sense. And the qualia in the narrower sense is something that you can extract and abstract, and then to compare that with other experience that you have. For example, here, the redness of the red is something that you can extract, and also circularness, or something like that, can be also extracted from this thing. And that's the narrower aspect of the qualia. So, now comes to the next question. After I clarified this, for those who came later, if you can scan this or go to this website, you can participate in this question. Can we address the question of this qualia in a hard problem? And also, can we solve this problem in a scientific manner? And for those people who are probably here who are really familiar, but the hard problem is the link between what it is like, what's the link between the phenomenal, qualia, and the physical. And maybe some people just, deny the existence of the hard problem as well. But for now, if that's the case, I think there's an option of other, I think. So you can also say that. And then I think I prepared the option of yes and yes. Like, we can address it, and also we can solve the hard problem in the future. I thought that, this is probably important for this audience to put this, qualification without quantum mechanics. Because the proposal that I'm going to make is without quantum mechanics, but I'm not against, actually, quantum mechanics, actually. I'm also, working on so-called quantum-like qualia hypothesis, so I'm totally open to that. But my question is whether the level of the qualia, hard problem, is it really relevant to invoke the quantum mechanics? So I think the last time we got the answer from 120, and this one tend to get the less answer because it's more kind of difficult. So I'll just go with this. Thank you very much. I think this is probably clear right now. Okay, let's see. Okay. So 43% says that yes, we can address it, but we cannot solve. Okay, that's great. That's what I expected from this audience. And yes, you're already positive 35, and very pessimistic people, 13%. I don't know why you came here by paying this expensive ticket. All right. I hope that I will change your mind. So, can we address the qualia scientifically? Traditional answer is absolutely no. And many people have heard that other speakers say that, oh, that's a qualia of the problem and the redness of red, and that's the end of the story, right? And in fact, Daniel Dennett, who died several years ago, actually put some kind of nail into the coffin of this qualia issue. Qualia cannot be explained or verbalizable and also shared, and also it's totally private and intrinsic, and that's why you cannot do the science, because all of them are going against objectivity and also extrinsic and also verbalizable, describable kind of essence of the science, right? But as a result, in fact, if you go to different kind of conference, this conference doesn't actually deal with this type of question, but go to some conference called ASSC, most empirical consciousness researchers tend to give up qualia in the first place. And then what they do is to find the neural correlates like looking at the brain by first binarizing the response. Like, instead of, you ask the quality of this experience per se, you first ask, did you see that or not? Like, detection paradigm, masking paradigm, invisibility paradigm. Or do you think this is red or, orange? Something like that. Discrimination, detection, and also this different kind of the stuff is mostly explaining 80 or 90% of the neuroscience of consciousness. But the problem is that this type of the evidence and also this type of the study does not constrain the theory of consciousness. And for those people who came to the Robert Kuhn's talk or talk yesterday, I forgot, sorry, his first name or last name. He counted the existing number of the theories of the consciousness, and it's right now 275. And a few years ago, it was roughly like 40 or something. So the more you look into it, it's probably more proliferating, and I think this is like a Cambrian explosion of the consciousness theories. And this is quite ironic or weird if you think about that, empirical neuroscience research of consciousness started around 1990s. And we are now 35 years since this, beginning of this, Tucson meeting, right? And then why does that empirical data doesn't constrain theories, but proliferate theories? And one of the culprits, I think this is just my speculation, is that many of the sort of the consciousness-related data is not strong enough to constrain the theories. So before going to my take, I just wanted to kind of advertise Susan Hossenfelder's YouTube blog. How many of you have seen this? Oh, that's great. So if you search for the title, Scientists Measure Qualia for the First Time, it was thought to be impossible. That is our project, actually. There was some kind of misrepresentation of our project, so hopefully you get it right today. But I think her video is quite interesting. And there are lots of pessimistic and angry comments. Last time I counted, it was 3,000. And I hope that you're not angry about that. But anyway, so my answer to this, can we address qualia scientifically is yes. I always believed that it should be yes, but I didn't know how. But now I found a way. That's a qualia structure. That's these T-shirts. And combination with the integrated information theory, that is another powerful theory that I don't think, there is no representation today or this conference. But or something like that will be promising, I would say. And that's what I wrote in this paper that I talked in the beginning. All right. So the qualia structure is our project in the interdisciplinary scientific project supported by Japanese government, and it runs from 2023 to 2028. And you can look at on the website. And what we are composed of is a mathematician and physicist, and also neuroimaging and linguistic, and also philosophy, especially phenomenology and cognitive development, and also information theorists and so on. So it's a very interdisciplinary project, and we try to understand qualia through and also others' mind. But the common kind of thread of this approach is that we take the structural approach to qualia, and the structural approach we are trying to go ahead the international. That's why I'm really excited about sharing this result today here. And also we are organizing some summer schools. So for those people who are interested in this kind of thing, this year it's already closed, but the next year or the year after, we probably organize it somewhere in Japan for intense 2-3 weeks of this summer school project. So far I haven't talked about what the heck this qualia structure is. And the idea is that I admit that I just can't describe this redness above and beyond. That's all. My experience of that is this. That's the end. It's indeed, ineffable, right? But what I can do for sure is that this is kind of similar to hard rest, and very different from, or slightly different shades from Sabine's, suit, right? But also many different kind of colors are completely different from this one. And what it means is that there isn't a way to avoid direct characterization of something that you don't know anything through its relationship. And in fact, this has been utilized in many, many different ways across different areas. That's a sort of the advantage of the interdisciplinary approach. For example, meaning of the words. If you go to the dictionary or thesaurus, what you find is that it's relationship, right? A word's definition is given by its relationship with others. So if you remember when you were a kid, like 6 years old or something, and when you open the dictionary, you don't understand anything. It's completely useless because you don't know the word that is explaining what you don't know, right? Also, the properties of animals and plants in the ecosystem, you can isolate the system and study it, but you never understand, what is happening in the, real life. And a black hole is also a very interesting thing for the physicists here because you can't directly measure black hole. Nothing comes out, right? But they pretend, I'm sorry, they pretend to know that they know a heck about, the black hole. Why? It's because they predicted and measured its interaction with other planets and other kind of objects around it. And that precisely defines what the black hole is. And also, mathematical, oriented people also know that there are many different kind of infinities, but infinities can be distinguished through its interaction with another infinity or, going to the limit and so on. And personality-wise, you can also understand my personality through reading my CV or whatever, but also you can identify that pretty much from my, Twitter link or, Facebook link or, how my family is constructed and so on. So this is a very intuitive kind of notion, but in mathematics called category theory, there's a precise notion called the Yoneda lemma. It's a kind of a theorem. And what it eventually says is that if you don't know the thing itself, but its relation to others, and then you can identify what it is. That's a sort of the mathematical kind of proof. So if you don't know whether A and B is the same, instead of trying to characterize A and B itself, A and billions other things relation, and B and billions other things relation, and if the relationship itself is the same, then A and B must be the same. That's the idea. Okay, and then this is our inspiration for how to characterize qualia. So instead of looking at the red itself, red's relationship with other things, that's a critical idea, right? And from here, I can already exclude many of the philosophical kind of position. In fact, very hardcore physicalism. Because, you know what? Many of you say that the red is very similar to purple, right? But the red, in wavelength-wise, it's very long. And the purple is very short. So in a one-dimensional representation of physical, wavelengths, red and purple is the opposite, but it's similar. So, very pure and a fundamental kind of physicalism must be false. Okay? So, let's go to the kind of experiment that we do. So I ask the participants to look at the center, and then we present some kind of patch in the display very briefly, and then I ask you guys to rate the similarity from 0 being very similar to 7 very different. So it goes like this. It was green and blue, and at also an unpredictable location, and you cannot move your eyes in the real experiment. And then okay, next trial, that was blue and green, so it's very different. For me, it's 7. It's a different shade of the green. It's very similar. It's 0, and so on. It's very intuitive, I think, right? So this is the kind of the similarity rating experiment we do. So the first experiment we did was fortunately published in a so-called PNAS, and we have also a free version of this paper up in this QR code. And we here collaborated with a linguist and also cognitive developmentalists. One thing that I was very struck when I started to talk with a developmental psychologist is that they say that the children below 3 or below 5 and so on seem to have very different kind of color experience. And I was very skeptical about that claim because I never remember any kind of experience. I mean, in general, my memory is really bad. I'm already, 48 years, so, I don't remember. But I never, have an impression that the world didn't look different in terms of color. But it's been known in the developmental psychology, if you ask children, how many people raise kids? How many people believe that they are colorblind until like 5 or so? Okay. But if you have kid right now around 3 years old, that would be very interesting to test, to show color of the blue, especially, and also green, interchangeably. And I ask them to name them. And it's known throughout the world, throughout the language, children confuses these two colors very much. So it's like, as you can see here, it's almost a 50-50 that they sometimes say, oh, green, sometimes say, oh, blue, on the same color. And that led to this kind of developmentalist, psychologists to believe that maybe they are not really experiencing the color in the same way as we do. And even the very, very striking color, like red and so pink and purple and yellow, they are also confused. So no wonder, to some extent, that they are suspecting the children's experience, right? But this is all above our reports. But what we did, what I at least was very, very suspicious was that maybe children is experiencing something, but cannot just verbalize it, right? So to address this kind of possibility, we developed this iPhone app, and it turns out it was very critical to develop this iPhone app because children cannot use a mouse or cannot use a keyboard by default. Maybe, very smart kids can do it, but, most of the kids cannot do it, but they are very good at iPhone, right? You're laughing. So you know that, my kid, when he was like towards the end of the first year, he already opened up, my password and then started to play the iPad game. And that's probably shared the experience with you guys, right? So children can definitely touch and then point very accurately, but they cannot speak sometimes. So when we did this version of experiment, they were able to give a very accurate report in the similarity, and also it was reliable. And then look at this structure. It was almost identical, completely identical to the adults. And then we were suspicious, so we went from 10 year, 7 year, 5 year, and 3 year. And then 2 year is the kind of a difficult age. They don't cooperate. So we have a hard time, but I think we are going to do that 2-year experiment. But we also looked at a different culture. Chinese culture seems to put a very different emphasis than the Japanese culture on redness, have a very different kind of meaning, but they are also completely the same in terms of the structure. So, but this is still kind of, not really get to this core question, right? Is my red your red? I'm proposing in this talk that we can ask this kind of thing in a more structured terms. And then in a core sense, I kind of try to say that the children's red is similar to our red for so far, okay? But is more, if I want to ask more fine question whether my red is similar to your red, then we need to extend it. So what we started to do is to go from 9 by 9 to 93 by 93 color similarity ratings, and it's through the more than 1,000 people online, and we tested it. And then we also introduced a little bit technical, but a very important notion of the unsupervised structure alignment technique to test this hypothesis. So this is the most technical part. So this is also published in this year, 2025, iScience, and this was actually featured in the Sabine, the YouTube video, actually. So traditional method is to ask by showing this color one by one, is this red your red, my red, and how much kind of correspondence there is, right? And then if there is some kind of a discordance, then you measure some kind of an error between them. And then do it one by one, and then purple, purple, blue, blue, and so on, and then compare that. And this is called supervised learning or supervised assessment. And a correlation method and many things, by default, they all do this. But the problem of this is that you already assume there is a correspondence. And then assume the correspondence has kind of more or less, correspondence or not. That's what they do. And in fact, if you do this method on the color typical and the color atypical people, then we get 0.67 correlation. And a 0.67 correlation, what the heck this number is, you say, but it's super significantly above chance, and it's much, much more stronger kind of statistics than reported from usual neuroscience, more or less. Roughly, that's the idea. But what does it mean? It's really unclear, because this is not measuring the shape or structure of the qualia. And on the other hand, our novel structure approach is looking at only the relationship between the qualia. And then from that, what we are going to do is to blind your color experience and just look at my color experience and its relationship, and then ask, is my color this one, or this one, or maybe this one? That's the proper approach to address the question of, is my red your red, right? So what we empirically do is to collect lots of dissimilarity, similarity rating matrix over the all combination of the colors, and then we visualize it in a lower dimensional manifold. And sometimes people believe that the color is a three-dimensional, but that's most likely to be false. It's likely that the color qualia dimension is much higher, at least probably 7 or something in our hands, but it's another story. So here is this is a most probably technical kind of a slide, so you can sleep here. You get this kind of data from one matrix and another, and then you quantify this number called the Gromov-Wasserstein distance. And what it means is that you pick one relationship from one space, right? And then maybe I'll just give an example in terms of the word translation between the two languages. Let's say in the English word, the cat and dog has some kind of a relationship, right? And then you have a corresponding different kind of language. In Spanish, what is a cat? Cattle. And then dog is? Perro, okay. Perro and then cattle. So these must be having some kind of similar relationship, right? And if the relationship is the same, then this Dij and DKL, D, cat and dog in English, and D, perro and cattle, must be same. And then this value can be 0, right? Then this penalty term, this gamma thing, this is read as gamma. It's very enigmatic Greek letter, can be very, very high. And then your task is to find the matrix of the gamma that minimizes this thing. So eventually what it means is that find many, many similar pairs between the two different domains, like my color space and your color space, and then align it perfectly, and then you get the exact match of the shape. That's the idea. And you can do it with a nice computational algorithm. So what end up is that my color structure, this we have the shape here, and then another one from yours, and then we match this shape through this procedure, and then eventually we use a color label from both sides. And then if this happens, like blue, blue, green, green, and so on, then your red is my red. But the opposite case here, the bottom right, that's my red is your purple. Okay? That's the idea. And then when we did this experiment, we need to distribute these experiments over the different kind of groups of subjects, but we also did that in the individual subjects as well. And the top one is a group of 100 subjects, and their representation of the color qualia structure. And then second one is another color typical people. And that has already very different shape, right? Because it's a completely different people from different world part, so it's no wonder that they look different. But again, the the real colors Qualia space is much higher dimension. So this is probably some kind of artifact introduced by the method of the visualization. But anyway, we also see this in color atypical people, where we identify them through the online test of the color blind, and then they are identified as a color red-green blind. Okay, and then they look also, quite, rich in terms of structure. By the way, now we have a lot of people here and a lot of male here, and it's expected that roughly 5 to 10% of the Caucasian people are red-green colorblind. So you don't need to tell me right now, but if you know that you are also red and green colorblind, and then tell me if you think that you do not experience color. It's probably nobody is going to say that. And that's really weird, right? Because normally we talk about the color typical versus color blind. But most people I met, they claim that they are, completely, full of the color in terms of experience. And what the heck does it mean is that their structure is in itself very rich, as we identified. But by doing this color alignment kind of technique, we find that typical to typical matches very well. And when there's a mistake, it's a really small mistake, minor mistake. But typical and atypical, they don't match at all. Remember that this correlation-wise, it's 0.6. But the matching rate it's almost like chance. And this is a kind of a detail, so I'll just skip. This is a typical to typical alignment, and it can go to 100% if you allow some kind of redundancy. And this is atypical to atypical. That also aligns really well. But this is atypical to typical. It doesn't align at all. And then this is also interesting to look into the old literature, where they did something similar, but only like eight colors. And what they found was that the difference between the structure of the color typical and the atypical lies only in the position of the green. And this also matches with many of the subjective reports from color atypical people. So turquoise, blue, yellow, violet, purple, red, orange, green, gold, and yellow, they are aligned almost the same. But the location of the green is different. For the normal people, it's closer between the turquoise and the yellow. But for this color green, red blind people, it's between the yellow, violet, and the red. So that's what we can also now identify from these kind of methods. So the Qualia structure project is to color approach to the Qualia in terms of structure manner, and then we can now quantify the structure without labels. And we can now applying this method into different different modality of the Qualia, like emotion and so on. Finally, in a few minutes, I want to talk about the sort of the next step into the future, how to dissolve the hard problem. So far, what I've been talking about is a Qualia structure in person A. And ideally, we want to have some kind of a method to unfold what's happening in the brain into predict what exactly kind of Qualia that this brain has. And one of the most promising kind of theory, I think, is the so-called integrated information theory by Tononi and other people. And this one has progressed a lot over the last 10 years, especially. And now they have a phenomenological explanation of space, time, and objects, and the color and the pain. Objects, color, pain will be coming in a few years, I think. So what if IIT is correct, or at least if IIT can be testable in terms of this kind of similarity relationship between different kind of Qualia, then we can now start to look at the correspondence between them. So, and here, I'm completely agnostic about IIT, but any kind of theory of the real theory of the consciousness or Qualia, if they have this kind of mapping kind of law, it's sometimes called psychophysical laws, then A's Qualia structure can be translated into some kind of brain-based or cause-effect structure of the person A's. And then that can be used to make a prediction about a similar cause-effect structure in the person B. And then that also allows you to go back to the prediction about Qualia structure of the person B, right? This is my solution to the Hyatt problem. If I predict this, my red is your red to the top left to top right, it should be also possible to go through bottom side. And in mathematical terms, it's called a commutative diagram. And as long as we have this commutative diagram from phenomenal to sort of brain-based cause-effect structure to something to, again, phenomenal, which completely matches with this phenomenal prediction, then I think that's the end. But in reality, it's very difficult. So I have a various kind of ongoing project into the future, and also so on. So I'll just skip for the interest of time. And I want to do this retest to you. And also, if you have a question, I also want to address that. Probably, I don't have much time, so I want to ask this. But for now, I'll finish. Thank you very much. Can you put the slide on?
Can you put his slides back up? We have time for some questions.
Please answer to this, and then I'll stop when it comes to 100.
Hi, thank you for the talk. My question is, does the structure and qualia, can we replace them? For example, if you ask me, what's your range of emotions? I can say that I go from here to here, and someone else can go from here to here. But when you ask them to arrange them in an order, all of us will agree on that order. But our experience is not the same. I might have an experience here, someone might have an experience here. But our structure is the same.
Yeah.
So how can we say that the structure equates qualia?
Right. So your method of trying to characterize an emotion using a rating, that I would consider it as an intrinsic way of trying to capture the emotion qualia. Right? You see or you experience happiness, and you answer 10 questions about happiness. But I think that's wrong, because it is trying to characterize it from inside. What is better, I think, is to prepare lots of emotion and then to compare them in terms of similarity or something else. And then this kind of problem actually resolves. We already see that in the case of a color. For example, Stuart may say red and purple is similar, but in the rating of 2. But I say they are similar at the level of 4. But this kind of difference is preserved across all the pairs. So inter-individual difference is cancelled in this way. But if you try to rate this thing, rate this thing, then this kind of intrinsic difference, cognitive bias or criterion bias magnifies all over the place.
Okay.
Hi, thank you
Yes.
so much. So I think you expressed that category theory, which is a relative theory, can explain qualia, which is revolutionary and awesome. It reminds me of relativity in physics, for lack of a better word. And in relativity, we see symmetries and conservation laws. Do you think that qualia will also have symmetry and conservation laws?
That's super excellent question. I also don't know. Yeah, but I suspect that something has to be there. Yeah, but I also don't think that physics is closed yet at all.
Hi, quick question. Why are there no cortically colorblind people?
Cortically colorblind, there is. It's already reported.
What does it mean?
So, for example, there is a lesion case where
A lesion, but genetically. So genetically we have millions.
There is
here
also
of-
genetically there is a people like that. So there is a people who don't have a one type or 2 types of cone, and then they say it's completely colorless. It's very different from a red-green colorblind, but sometimes there are some people who have only rod and then one type of a cone or something. They don't experience color.
Because of mutations in which gene?
Yeah, probably also some kind of disorder. But I'm not a color scientist, I don't know. But maybe you would be interested to hear the fact that marmosets who lives near Mexico, their females are half color, typical trichromats, and then half dichromats, only 2 color. And then most of the males are all dichromats, but they don't differ in terms of behavior.
Yes, but this is all in the eye. This is all mutations in the eye.
Right.
Once the signal gets into the brain, the rendering of the color never fails. Why is that so?
I'm not so sure, but maybe I can ask you to clarify your question
I'll find
later.
you on
Yeah.
LinkedIn and we'll follow up.
Yeah.
Okay.
And if you have any question further, you can also type in as well.
One more?
Yes, simply for earlier children, the Swedish are switching from digital back to books. Now, I just put that, I can go 100 different directions regarding that. Think of the implications of that. I mean, they're doing it throughout their educational system and putting money into it because their research, well, you can go on from there or we can just leave it.
Okay. Yeah, maybe we can chat later as well.
Okay, let's thank Dr. Tsuchiya again.
Thank you.
And please welcome our next speaker, Dr. Stuart Hameroff.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mike, everybody, for being here. I'm going to talk about correlates of qualia in microtubule time crystal dynamics. I agree more or less with now that there should be a qualia structure, but I think it's a different approach is needed, not only for qualia, but for consciousness in general. And what you see in this picture is a time crystal rendition of a microtubule and some other things that might be entangled with a microtubule, and I'll come back to that point. So we're celebrating 100 years of EEG since Hans Berger, and it's been very, very useful and clinically utilized. And here's a picture. I think this guy's been around a lot in every Wikipedia thing on EEG. And we know that EEG comes from pyramidal cells in the layer 5 of cortex, specifically the apical dendrites, and these are right at the scalp, and we get a bunch of squiggly lines like this. And when I first started in medicine, people read these by hand, just shifting through them, and got pretty good. Even I did it, just looking at the frequencies. Well, here's a high, that's probably gamma, that's probably beta, theta, blah, blah, blah. And you could actually tell stuff, and they'd go through this and say, okay, it's normal or it's not. And I said, wow, how did you know that? But anyway, we've come a long way with that. And in anesthesia, where we want simple, quick ideas of just how deeply anesthetized the patient is, they have these brain monitors that process EEG and probably some EMG also, and come up with a number, a single number. We called it the idiot number because they didn't tell us what it was. And basically, 80 to 100 is awake. This patient's awake but sedated because she's at 91. 40 to 60 is anesthetized. And they're still used. I didn't use them in anesthesia because when I had one, I was focused at the number and pay less attention to the patient. And I thought it was better just to look at the patient more. But anyway, that's another story. But this is an article from Michael X. Cohn in 2017. Where does EEG come from and what does it mean? Surprisingly little is known about how EEG features link to cognition. And the first two speakers gave great talks, and it's all based on EEG and electrophysiology at one low frequency range, which I'll come back to. Synchronized potentials of apical dendrites of cortical layer 5 pyramidal neurons produce EEG, but this doesn't explain the meaning or content of EEG. And Michael X. Cohn said, there are no grand unified theories presented for EEG. The asterisk indicates that there is one now, and I'll come to it later. And finally, he said, analysis of multiple spatial and temporal scales are needed. That's a bingo. That's exactly the problem, because EEG is just the slow end of a much greater hierarchy of frequencies, which is what we're going to get to. So most neuroscientists and AI view the brain as a complex computer of simple neurons operating in hertz, okay, with gamma synchrony 40 hertz, and we heard about 150 hertz this morning. So, and consciousness is seen as an emergent output of these computations, and neuron firings are bits, and this is an insult to neurons. I call these cartoon neurons. And I think for good reason, because basically they have one output, they're algorithmic, they're membrane only, and they're at one slow frequency. And more importantly, single cell paramecium can swim, learn, avoid predators, find food, find a mate, have sex. They have no synapses, no networks. They use their microtubules to sense, navigate, and process information. These same microtubules are in neurons and are probably doing much more important things than we attribute. But let's go back to AI for a second. In the last few decades, I guess, deep learning neuronal networks add hidden layers, providing novel aspects to cognitive perception. So here's a simple network. If you add a bunch of networks in between hidden layers, you get interesting phenomenal perceptions or outputs. It changes it for the better in many ways. But if AI was really cool, they would have fractal deep learning. What that means is, so here's a network, and in every node of this network, let's say you put a whole nother network like this. And in every node of this network, you put a whole nother network like this. And every node of this, another one, and another one. Fractal deep learning. I just made that up the other day. But you know why? Because that's what the brain does. That's exactly what the brain does. Fractal deep learning in the brain. If you look at, here's a synapse, an axon, a dendritic spine, dendrite, microtubules connected, and microtubules are processing information at a deeper level, faster level, smaller, and eventually gets to the quantum level. And we've known for many years that microtubules can, and now evidence shows that they can process information. Here's a paper I did in 1990 on microtubule automata. Microtubules are cylindrical lattices of a protein called tubulin. They can interact locally and probably non-locally, process information, and neighbor interactions compute. And for clocking updates back in the 90s, we applied Froelich coherence in megahertz or gigahertz, which is a theory. Now we know megahertz and gigahertz occur in microtubules thanks to the work of Anirban. And we also published the idea that memory is encoded in microtubules, for example, by CAMK2 phosphorylation. The idea that synapses encode memory can't be right because synaptic proteins last hours to days and memories last lifetimes. Dendritic microtubules are quite stable, the lattice is preserved, and they are by far the most likely place for memory. And microtubules do a lot of things. They act as motors. They act as railroad tracks for motor proteins, which deliver synaptic cargo by motor proteins, kinesin and dynein. And the tau protein is a microtubule-associated protein. Tau famous for being dislodged and forming tangles in Alzheimer's. And their traffic signals, they tell the kinesin where to get off and go to a particular synapse along this dendrite. So their precise placement is essentially memory. And what happens in Alzheimer's disease is that the microtubules fall apart, the tau falls off, forms these tangles, and you lose memory. Well, you're losing the place where memory is stored, and also the whole neuron's falling apart. Despite that, everybody in neuroscience and Alzheimer's pays attention to these amyloid plaques, which are ugly, and these antibody drugs, $40,000 per year per patient, they don't work, and they're ignoring the real problem, which is that inside the neurons, the microtubules are falling apart. We'll come back to that point, because there's actually a treatment for it. But getting back to hidden layers and deeper levels inside neurons, microtubules are the additional layers of processing inside neurons, like deep learning in AI. How many layers? That's the question. Well, we actually have an answer for that. Anirban Bandyopadhyay, who's here, has shown that there are 12 orders of frequency processing inside microtubules in a self-similar processing way. So this is a summary of about 10 or 15 years of experiments at 3 scales. Here's a neuronal network level where you see the neurons here, and you see electrodes. And here's a smaller scale, single microtubule with 10 electrodes, rows of tubulin with 4 electrodes, smaller and smaller. And in each case, if you apply a voltage, the microtubule or the system is an insulator. But if you apply an alternating voltage, an alternating current, and sweep the frequency, you'll find specific frequencies where all of a sudden the system, the microtubule, gets highly conductive. So you see these peaks. And at every 3 orders of magnitude, in hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, you see 3 peaks, and each peak has 3 peaks, triplets of triplets. So here we see an AFM picture of the the triplets, which he's calling octaves. Then you go down a level and scale, and you do the same thing, and you get the same triplets of triplets in kilohertz, megahertz, and gigahertz. And you go further down into the tubulins, you see the exact same triplets of triplets in megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. So we're seeing this cell-similar resonance fractal-like pattern of dynamic resonance occurring every 3 orders of magnitude, from hertz to terahertz. It would be extremely useful in biology to transcend scale. So we have processes at very, very small scales, fast scales, that they can transcend up to consciousness, for example. So there's Anirban, and these are found in hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. I don't know if this is a video. This is a video. Okay, I guess it's not going to show. But it's a video of detecting megahertz. Oh, there it is. So this is our friend Hide, and he's holding a single megahertz probe to his head, and on the screen you can see a triplet. And it's actually a video. He takes it away, it goes away. But these triplets from the temple are quite reproducible if you don't have a lot of electrical noise, and it's a problem in cities. But if you go out in the country or out in the desert or anywhere away from a bunch of noise, it's highly reproducible to get triplets of triplets from the temple or various other regions around the head. And in this case, megahertz. It's easy to pick up in megahertz. You set the analyzer between 6 and 26 megahertz, and you see these triplets, as long as there's not too much electrical noise. And this is my scan. You can see me actually. I'm taking a picture in the reflection. Because I hadn't figured out how to get it out of the system any other way. And it turns out that I actually have 5 peaks, not 3. And here's an extra one, and maybe an extra one here, and maybe these are extra ones. And other people have these too, and they actually also occur in altered states. So this is measuring megahertz. So EEG, again, is hertz. Kilohertz is used in Neuralink, so we're down to megahertz. Gigahertz is difficult, but terahertz, we now know, comes out of the brain, and also when put into the brain, as we heard in the photobiomodulation talk by Lou Lim, can actually influence. So all of these frequencies have been shown to be emitted from the brain and have effects on the brain, with the possible exception of gigahertz, which is microwave. And I'm not interested in putting microwave into the brain, and that may be the problem in Havana syndrome, for example. Too much resonance of the microtubules causing them to shatter. So this leads to a hierarchy, a scale-invariant hierarchy that Anirban developed and I helped him with. And basically it starts with a level of neuron in hertz, and there's the triplets. And you go to microtubule networks in megahertz, kilohertz, and then microtubules in megahertz, and then the rows of the dipoles in gigahertz, then the individual tubulin in terahertz, and even faster in high terahertz and petahertz. And this is where anesthesia works on these quantum dipole oscillations inside the tubulin, which leads to oscillations and also consciousness when the collapse occurs. So a scale-invariant hierarchy of triplets from microtubules inside brain neurons, and this has been reproduced and in many, many papers published by Anirban and others now. So the question is, are microtubules time crystals? So, okay, what's a time crystal? Well, they've become pretty popular lately. Here are 4 pictures of them from prominent publications. This doesn't really explain them, except the pictures are pretty cool, but it gives you a flavor of what they might be, and I'm going to try to unpack that. So time crystals were proposed in physics in 2012 by Nobel laureate Frank Wilczek. They have self-similar dynamics repeating in multiple time frequency domains. The lowest energy ground state must be an oscillator, and so they are quantum systems. They have been created with spin states in masers and in quantum computers by Google with qubits using identical components. So like in a quantum computer, you have a bunch of qubits, and in the masers, you have a bunch of spin states. They're all the same. They interact, and you can have time crystal behavior. Microtubules are more complicated because they're polyatomic. They're not made of one component. They're actually pretty complex. They're biological. And we've identified 4 separate systems accounting for 4 levels of self-similar activity. So I don't know, is this video gonna run? Can you run it, or do I have to do? Oh, there we go. Okay. So on the outside are the kilohertz. These are the C termini interacting with the water, and these are in kilohertz. And this may be how kilohertz, like in the Neuralink, interacts. And then the microtubule itself has megahertz oscillations, and I think these are the key oscillations. And inside the water molecules, and they're oscillating in gigahertz. And then terahertz comes out of is photons coming out of the tubulin itself from the aromatic rings, which aren't shown. So that's a 4 separate system. How they get to be coordinated temporally, dynamically, with cell-similar patterns is a really good question. There must be something advantageous to the system in evolution, probably to optimize consciousness and pleasure, because I think that's what drives evolution. But we'll come back to that point. Oh, it's going to do it again. Okay, let's move on. So I'm going to report on an experiment that Anirban did in his book he wrote, Nanobrain. And basically, in this experiment, they studied humans and with dielectric resonance probes on the scalp, and you can measure terahertz, gigahertz, megahertz, and kilohertz, and they use these to come up with loop-like patterns, which are similar to the kind of structures that now showed, except here we get them not only for hertz, but also for kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. And these are converted into these loops are oscillators, basically. So everything's frequency, as somebody said the other day. And these can be, oscillators can be modeled or represented as clocks. So the whole brain eventually can be represented as clocks within clocks within clocks within clocks. Probably everything can, to some extent. So, and then the clocks are lined up along their equators and how they couple and interact, and they kind of couple and correlate, and you have these time crystals, which clocks within clocks, which it turns out when he went back and correlated this with the mood of the subject at the time, he found particular patterns of clocks within clocks of time crystals correlating with things like their personality, introvert, extrovert, whether they were depressed, whether they're demanding and aggressive, provocative, ordering, leadership, inducing completeness, trapping and brainwashing, and racial, cultural, and so forth. So personality traits, attitudes, correlate with particular patterns. Now, they probably do it with EEG or anything, but those are very crude, and I don't think they would come anywhere close to this level of sophistication, because this is not only including just the hertz, but also the much faster frequencies. So this is more to the nitty-gritty of what's going on in the brain. So here's let's see if this is going to run. This is he found 1,023 classes of clocks essential to build a human brain model. And here's a polyatomic time crystal model of the brain, but it doesn't look like it's going to run. So we'll move on. Oh, there it goes. Okay. So it's moving slowly. It's actually moving much faster, but this is so we can see what they're supposed to represent. And so the smaller the spheres, the faster the oscillations. And so you can put all kinds of frequencies together and come up with a polyatomic or a time crystal with multiple frequency scales. And here's another one. Let's see if this is going to run. Okay, so this is more like real time, or what could be real time, when you consider the fast ones are going in terahertz and the slow ones are going in hertz. So this would be a time crystal representation of a portion of the brain. The whole brain would be somewhat more complicated. And here's kind of the punchline for the Qualia story, and that is to say, when with these loops and patterns and invariants, Anirban calls them, which could be similar to what Now was talking about in terms of representations of a particular qualia or any component of consciousness. And then they plotted them, and they plotted them. It turned out they plotted onto a hexagon of hexagons. So each of these are 6, and then there's 6 of them, and they correlated them with what the patient reported they were feeling at the time. Or they asked the patient or the subject to feel love, or to think of, or to be in pain, or to be sensing, and to actually think or feel about certain things like justice and relations and that sort of thing. So these are the qualia, or the emotions, and they map to these representations shown here. So this is a map of qualia and emotions based on time crystal behavior. And why is that better than just relational and correlating? Because these are actually correlating with what the patient is feeling at the time, whether they're feeling it spontaneously or because somebody told them to do so. So I think this is a better representation, and I think the time crystal itself will be a better way of looking at brain dynamics than EEG, which is only the tip of the iceberg, to mix metaphor, the slow end of an iceberg. I often say that EEG, looking at the brain, is like going to the symphony and only hearing the low bass and percussion, missing all the flutes and piccolos and everything else. So if you go deeper and faster, you get much richer dynamics and a much better way of telling us what's really going on in the brain. So how does this map out to what we do know about the brain? And basically, we know that conscious perception involves three waves from thalamus. So whether it's optical or auditory or touch or whatever, everything except smell runs through the thalamus. And in the case of vision, goes to V1, the back of the brain, and then moves forward to the front of the brain in associative cortex, and then from the front of and then is radiated outward to other areas. And it's the third wave that correlates with consciousness, which can take several hundred milliseconds after sensory impingement, although we see and perceive things more quickly because of a backward time effect that needs quantum effects, but I'm not going to talk about that. So the other theories in consciousness studies, what I call the cartoon neuron theories, because they're all based on only membranes and only slow hertz, and IIT doesn't even have any neurons, it's all information. But they're all sort of the same thing, going forward and backward, and this would be HOT, and this is PCRP, which is probably the best of these, and actually happens at multiple levels, including inside neurons and microtubules. So to some extent, they all follow the same pattern of representation. But what I want to point out is this. So if you start at the back of the brain in V1, these waves that are measured in EEG frequency, but probably almost for sure have to be including at deeper, faster levels inside them. So the kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, terahertz is happening inside. But when measuring the EEG, as we go from back to front, the processes get slower, slower, slower. We get to the frontal cortex, and it radiates outward. And this is like global workspace or HOT, and this correlates with consciousness. And then we get to the cortex and the 6 layers, and these come into 4, and then they go to 1, 2, 3, and 6, and then they converge on layer 5. And we know, at least coming from the top, as they come down, and Matthew Larkham's going to talk about this tomorrow, I think, about coming down the apical dendrites slower, 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 until they get to the pyramidal cell body, which is where I think consciousness occurs, most likely to occur, particularly because these pyramidal cell bodies are linked laterally by basilar dendrites, which span the whole cortex, kind of a blanket over the whole cortex, and the pyramidal cells are kind of the apex of the perception-action cycle, and as Walter Freeman told us for many years, and therefore the most likely to integrate inputs, orchestrate them, and then put outputs, because their outputs can go directly to spinal cord, at least in premotor cortex. So they're where you want consciousness to happen. You've got all the information coming in, you make a decision, and you move your arm, or you order something for lunch, and that's consciousness. But I think it's happening in the pyramidal cell bodies and dendrites, and in particular because dendrites and soma have mixed polarity microtubules, because they're interrupted and of mixed polarity. So some go up, the neighbors go down, and you can get recursive loops, recursive information processing, which is probably where predictive coding and recurrent processing occur, and they interfere and get slower and slower, and that's how you get from very, very fast down to like a hertz, 10 hertz or alpha rhythms or something like that. So the whole system is downshifting during the whole conscious perception processing from the back of the brain to the front, and then radiating outward. So downshifting seems to be important. That's how we get from very, very fast to slow enough for cognitive epochs and for us to exist in the real world. And in fact, the pyramidal layer with its basilar dendrite forming this network was cited by Carl Pribram in the 70s, as giving rise to a hologram that was conscious. This was the holographic theory of consciousness, and I thought that was a beautiful idea. And he was criticized because, as he told me later, people told him, well, for a hologram, you need a laser to make a holographic plate or something like that. And Carl, there's no lasers in the brain. I said, Carl, there sure are. They're called microtubules. And we actually wrote a paper, and I still think this is a good model. And wouldn't it be nice to have a hologram inside our heads, having our three-dimensional imagery that we're so fond of? So I think that's still a viable idea. We just needed to know more about what's going on inside the neurons. So this is a model from Justin Riddle and Jonathan Schooler, who were here. They presented, I think it was last year, maybe they presented it before last year at the Tucson conference. And basically, they start with small, fast back here, and go, and they kind of go. It's a multi-scale hierarchy going larger, slower, until at some level you get to the U, or the self, or the now, or whatever you want to call it. But they started, their small, fast would be individual neurons. And as then they go to networks of neurons and networks of networks of neurons, and then even larger networks. So I think the idea is right, but they need to shift to much faster, smaller areas. So I would change this to the slow fast being, let's say, 10 megahertz in quantum, and winding up at 10 hertz like alpha rhythm. So this is where we're going to have cognitive epochs and visual gestalts and this and that, but it's kind of a consolidation or a downshifting from 10 megahertz in quantum. And if you go the other way, let's say you take a psychedelic or you meditate, and you go more, we have evidence actually from a megahertz that under psychedelics you have more faster and more intense megahertz, and probably also gigahertz and terahertz. And I think this probably relates to the psychedelic state and what Robin Carhart-Harris calls the entropic brain, which is his description of what happens under psychedelics. It becomes more, not disordered, but more entropic. And as Brian Lord said the other day when I was talking to him about it, he said, well, yeah, you get more fractal-like when people are on psychedelics. And I think that's exactly what's happening. This is kind of a fractal system, and as you get, psychedelics take you deeper more into the quantum state, and our perceptions, our consciousness becomes more like a fractal, and where you see the smaller components of it. This could also be the subconscious, and it also leads to the holographic concept. So let's go back to Alzheimer's for a second, because this is one of my pet peeves. And as I'm getting older, I want to scratch it off my bucket list. And it annoys the hell out of me, actually, because we know that the microtubules falling apart are really what causes the symptoms. And the tau's dislodged, and the amyloid probably has very little to do with the symptoms. And there's actually a fairly easy treatment, and that's ultrasound. And ultrasound is megahertz. As I mentioned, microtubules have megahertz. And this experiment and many others, this is from Wen et al., 2003. I didn't put the reference there. But they had a neuron in culture. They cut one of the dendrites, or maybe that's the axon, I don't know. But when they used ultrasound to stimulate, to resonate, this grew back. The dendrite or the neurite grew back. And it's been shown in other studies that megahertz at low intensity promotes neurons to regrow. And it's been used for Alzheimer's. The first clinical study of ultrasound into the brain for mental states was done by me and my colleagues at the University of Arizona in 2013. And when I proposed it to my anesthesia colleagues, they said, yeah, right, you go first. And so I did. You got a nice shaved head, your idea, be our guest. So we sat around a conference table at the end of a long day in the OR. They wheeled in this ultrasound machine. I said, okay, what the heck? I had done my homework. I knew that it was approved for brain imaging, so it can't be that bad. It was used and is still used for newborns. Through the fontanelle with no bones at all to look for subarachnoid bleeds, and they would look for half an hour and not even worry about it, and no ill effects. Maybe it helped the kids, who knows? But anyway, after our studies showed improved mood, we did a double-blind controlled study in chronic pain patients who were depressed, and you can't really tell the machine's on, so it's easy to do a double-blind. And we got a positive result. The mood was improved. Since then, there have been hundreds of studies of ultrasound effects on mental states. Most people have gone to focused ultrasound because you can focus on one particular part of the brain. And Jay Sanguinetti, who's here, who is at our university and picked up on it, and has done a lot of great work in this area, using focused ultrasound to induce mindfulness by hitting the posterior cingulate cortex, and other things where you can focus. For Alzheimer's, I don't think you need focus because the lesions are everywhere. Now, some people are using it in Alzheimer's to hack away at the amyloid plaques, which is pretty dumb. I would not do that. And you can also use it to open the blood-brain barrier to get drugs in. You don't need to do that. Low intensity, below thermal threshold is very useful, and it gives you a pleasant buzz. You feel really good for a while. It's completely painless. There have been hundreds of studies and 700 patients at least in reviews with no serious adverse effects. And so, as I showed, you can regenerate the neurons. And we're doing a study that's approved by the IRB at California, at IONS, the California Institute of Human Science in Encinitas, California, where the patients are advised to get a particular device which is below thermal threshold, and we monitor them and survey them and get their get feedback for how they're doing and whether it's helping or not. And we hope to improve that and begin clinical studies. And for now, we're using a device that seems to work just fine and is approved through the IRB. So let's go back to theories of consciousness. I mentioned these other ones, which I refer to as cartoon neurons. I know they don't like that, but sorry, that's what they are. They're really cartoons of what a neuron is. They're insults to neurons. And these roadmaps or schematics or whatnot may be useful, or they may not be, but they're not really telling us what consciousness is or how it's produced. It's kind of like pin the tail on the brain map. Okay, maybe it's here, maybe it's here, but I don't find them that useful, but of course I'm biased. So the theory I do favor, of course, is the Orko-R theory, Penrose-Hameroff, that Roger Penrose and I developed back in the mid-90s. Roger spoke yesterday, and we've been severely criticized right from the start. The brain's too warm, wet, and noisy. That's impossible, blah, blah, blah. Microtubules don't have anything to do with anything. But over the years, at the current point in time, I would say that there is far more evidence for our theory than all the other theories combined. So what's the evidence? Well, this is one experiment that was done as part of the T.W. Templeton World Charity Foundation big study on of all the theories. We couldn't match up with any other theory in an adversarial collaboration because they're all at the cartoon neuron level and we're at the nitty-gritty quantum level, although it does relate. So we did this study where we predicted we would show a quantum effect in a microtubule at warm temperature and it would go away with anesthesia, and we did. And we first found that microtubules are efficient light harvesters. They also emit photons, and you may have seen the recent paper from Narosha Murugan and her group showing that buried in the EEG are photons coming out of the brain. And we also know that photons going into the brain have beneficial effects. So largely the microtubule. There are other sources of photons, including mitochondria and reactive oxygen species. But microtubules themselves emit at 489 nanometers, which is blue-green. So if qualia have anything to do, or the redness has anything to do with the wavelength that's going on, that would be blue-green, and by various things it could shift back and forth. So, and then I think ultimately the qualia actually have to do with curvatures in space-time geometry that I showed in my talk on Sunday. We also showed that tryptophan fluorescence lifetimes and photoexcitation diffusion in microtubules persist longer than classical Forster mechanisms and are presumably quantum in nature. Anesthetics, the anesthetics etomidate and isoflurane both significantly inhibited the photoexcitation diffusion and electronic energy migration. So we made those predictions, we called our shot, we did the experiment, and both of them worked. And as far as I can tell, in all the other Templeton projects, nobody has shown any positive result for any other theory. And the big showdown between Global Neuronal Workspace and IIT was a tie, and they found, or inconclusive, and they found negative aspects on both theories. So they gave more money to do it again for some reason. Anyway, other evidence, genomics, proteomics, optogenetics show anesthetics act on microtubules rather than on membrane proteins to selectively and reversibly block consciousness. Travis Craddock, who was here in our group, showed that modeling of terahertz oscillations among 86 aromatic amino acids in tubulin are inhibited by all anesthetics proportional to their potency. This is a Meyer-Overton correlation. And Mike Weiss mentioned this this morning. Nanotechnology shows self-similar coherent excitations in microtubules and tubulin in hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. And megahertz and gigahertz have been detected from the scalp, as I showed you. You can measure DGG from the scalp. Anirban has done that. And finally, as Mike Weiss showed this morning, microtubule stabilizing drugs antagonize effects of general anesthetic gases on animals and humans, indicating microtubules are the sites of anesthetic action. We've also shown recently, both Anirban and also Hide Sagusa have shown inhibition of megahertz in patients going under anesthesia. And we've also shown preliminary evidence of increased megahertz activity under psychedelics, increasing both the intensity, shifting the frequency to higher frequencies, and also kind of wave splitting where patients, subjects go from, say, 3 peaks to 5 peaks as they're having the experience of the psychedelic. So we're going to be hearing more about that, I think. So this is the time crystal. This is from the cover of Anirban's book, Nanobrain, which I finally got around to reading, and it's pretty amazing, actually. And basically the idea is that, so you have these clocks within clocks, and the red things are clocks of different sizes and they're different frequencies. And these clocks within clocks, or maybe these could be a GABA receptor or some other protein that's entangled. So it's not just the microtubules, it's any protein that has aromatic rings in it that can couple. And this roughly correlates with the multi-scale hierarchy we showed earlier. And we're pinning this down, and then it comes to where it's too fast for biology, but it could continue in space-time geometry. As we heard William Brown say yesterday, that there could be memory embedded in the fine structure of the universe, and eventually, or the Penrose mechanism, curvature in space-time. So this is a model for a microtubule, but also the whole brain, which can act collectively through entanglement to act as a time crystal, which means that maybe there is a unified theory of EEG after all. So my conclusions are the brain has collective microtubule oscillations in hertz, kilohertz, megahertz, gigahertz, and terahertz. This is called the DDG, the dodecanogram. A unified theory of EEG by interference patterns, so a unified theory of EEG. Actually, Roger and I proposed that in 2014 when we first realized that there had to be interference among the disrupted microtubules in dendrites of pyramidal cells and soma of pyramidal cells. And we were trying to figure out how we got from so very fast to very slow. And he said, well, maybe it's negative resonance. And I said, what's that? He says, interference, like in music, beats. And in fact, I think consciousness is a lot more like music than computation, and the brain is more like a quantum orchestra than it is a computer. And the time crystal idea fits with this very nicely. You would need something like that. These oscillations are characterized as time crystals in which different frequency dynamics are clocks within clocks within clocks. In studies in humans, time crystal representations are based on DDG, correlate with qualia, and I think the qualia themselves are actually particular patterns of curvature in space-time geometry, or maybe along the lines of what William was talking about yesterday, which may turn out to be the same thing. Also, Alzheimer's disease can be reversed with transcranial ultrasound, cheaply, safely, easily. And finally, ORCOR has more explanatory power, biological connection, and supportive evidence than the other theories of consciousness combined. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have time for some questions.
Thank you so much. If a microtubule is the origin of consciousness, can green, blue light to use, read, and write program Qualia?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the last part.
Can green, blue light read and write and program consciousness through microtubule?
I think the photons in the brain are actually entangled and communicate, and what gets out may or may not have anything to do with consciousness. I think it's kind of a currency of consciousness. It's used at that high level, just like slower quasi-particles and can also. So I think they're part of it, but whether they themselves, whether the radiating photons have anything to do with consciousness, I don't know. They may, but I think more importantly is there's excitonic propagation from those photons in the microtubule system that stays in the quantum phase and doesn't get out. That's probably more related to consciousness, but there can also be non-local effects of any of these frequencies because they're in the quantum domain, and like we saw this morning, there is pretty good evidence for parapsychological effects.
Hello, Dr. Hameroff. It's good to speak to you again. I'm kind of a little bit, sorry, over here. I'm a little bit confused on your claim with the symptoms can be reversed, because if we're claiming that memory is stored in microtubules, then if we're still having the neurons degrade, even if we're having you're using ultrasound to extend more microtubules and grow them back, wouldn't we still be losing memories and basically still be amnesiac almost and still lose in the end? Because the actual to my knowledge, it is not my field, I believe that tau detaches because of hyperphosphorylation and enzyme inconsistencies and stuff that wouldn't be fixed by such a treatment. So how do you actually propose that it would work?
Well, it's unclear whether the tau falls off, destabilizing the microtubules, because it gets phosphorylated while on the hyperphosphorylated on the microtubule, or whether the microtubule disassembles and depolymerizes, releasing the tau, which then gets phosphorylated while it's sitting around in the neuron. Either way, you lose the tau, you lose the stabilization if tau is actually stabilized in the microtubule, and you lose the encoding of the tau, telling the motor proteins where to get off and deliver their cargo. So you're damaging synaptic plasticity. And more importantly, you're losing the integrity of the microtubules. So so neurons don't divide. Brain neurons don't divide, right? So people say, well, memory's in the synapses, but those synaptic proteins last hours to days and they're gone, and memories can last lifetimes. Now, if the microtubule lattice, there's about 1 billion tubulins per neuron. Each tubulin can have about 22 different genetic isoforms. I know there are 5 post-translational modifications, phosphorylation, et cetera. So about 30 possibilities. So the number of different, so you have 1 billion to the 30th power of tubulin states forming like a mosaic in a neuron. Now, in cells other than neurons, those microtubules every once in a while would have to disassemble, reform as mitotic spindles to do mitosis, cell division. And then once the daughter cells are formed, they reform, and you would have lost all the memory, which is in the lattice relationship, the mosaic within the microtubule. Neurons don't divide, so they don't have to do that. And in dendrites and soma, they're also capped at both ends, because microtubules generally can treadmill. They can lose from here and add from here. So even though they're stationary, the microtubules, the tubulins themselves are changing. That doesn't happen in dendrites. They're capped at both ends. So that's how you can preserve the lattice relationship over a lifetime. And so ultrasound, so if the microtubules fall apart and you use low intensity ultrasound, they reform, they repolymerize, and they regrow. Presumably the tau would go back on, and memory is distributed. I mean, Pribram's idea of a hologram was based on the idea that Lashley, in the first part of the 20th century, spent 50 years trying to find the engram of memory. Where in the brain is memory stored? So I don't know how many dogs and animals he taught a trick, and then went and looked in the brain for where the memory is stored, and could never find it. After 30 years, he said, jokingly, I think, memory is impossible. And that's why Pribram came up with a hologram, because it's distributed, it's everywhere. It's like a hologram. You know, if you make a hologram in a photographic plate, you smash the plate with a hammer, 1 million little pieces, you take one sliver, you illuminate it with a laser, and you get the whole image again. Okay, you've lost resolution, it's kind of blurry, but you're getting the whole image. So that's the advantage of holographic memory, where it's distributed, and that's how memory is. I mean, the hippocampus is important, but memory is actually stored everywhere. So I don't see a problem with what I said based on what you said.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Lisa from Changa Institute. I appreciate you mentioning psychedelics, and I was wondering if you believe that psychedelics can be a novel, innovative treatment to extend brain longevity and heal Alzheimer's and other brain aging-related disease.
Well, maybe. I think there's good reason to think so, as Dr. Penberthy told us this morning, and many other people are showing they're useful for that. What I'm mostly interested in is the mechanism of the psychedelic state, and I think I was always wondering whether psychedelics acted on microtubules, but as I forget who it was this morning was saying that 5-HT2A receptor blockers like ketanserin block the psychedelic effect. And, but about 2 years ago, maybe it was a year ago, D.E. Olson at UC Davis did a beautiful study showing that there are actually intraneuronal 5-HT2A receptors in the microtubule-associated protein matrix in dendrites. So, the psychedelics would go inside the neuron and bind to these 5-HT2A receptors that are basically stuck on the outside of the microtubule and exert their action that way. Plus, they could act through metabotropic receptors and so forth. So I think ultimately the psychedelic action is going to be shown to increase the excitation frequencies and intensity, and maybe the splitting that I mentioned in the microtubules. I think, and we know from anesthesia that there's only one common target for anesthesia, and it's microtubules. The evidence is looking like that. There may be one final common target for psychedelics also. I forget which psychedelic takes a while to kick in. Maybe it's LSD, whereas other ones are quicker. But I think ultimately the effect is going to be on microtubules, because that's where I believe consciousness arises.
One more. Who was it?
So if our consciousness depends on quantum effects happening in microtubules, how to account for our brains and bodies functions that are not part of our usual conscious experience? Should we assume that the parts developed at early stages of the evolution are playing a lesser part?
I missed something.
Okay,
should we assume what?
Yeah, should we assume that the parts of the brain developed at the early stages of evolution play just a lesser part in our conscious experience, or and just for example, our human prefrontal cortex is the major player?
Yeah.
Or can we even maybe put on the table a hypothesis that there might be more than one conscious experiences running in one brain?
I don't think so. I mentioned this in my workshop talk, but I came to the conclusion in 2017 that I couldn't figure out evolution. I couldn't figure out why a life would originate, these molecules would get together, organize, do purposeful things, form my cells, form simple organisms, and develop and avoid getting eaten, find food, reproduce, do all this purposeful behavior for 1 million years before genes arrived on the scene, without any feedback, without any reason. And it occurred to me that the Penrose OR, which is the only specific physical theory for consciousness, for qualia, ever put forth, would have been present before life began in the early universe. It can happen in space-time geometry without any matter. So I wrote a paper in 2017 called The Quantum Origin of Life, How the Brain Evolved to Feel Good, and kind of revisited the primordial soup with operin and haldane in my cells, in which there were amphipathic biomolecules which look a lot like dopamine, the pleasure molecule, and they get together by van der Waals forces and they would oscillate coherently and eventually reach threshold for OR moments and have a moment of proto-conscious experience. Proto-conscious meaning disconnected and random, but some of those would be pleasurable. And therefore the system, the molecules would reorganize to access and optimize pleasure. And life began, and life developed to optimize pleasure, and then we're still doing that. We're at this conference because we love consciousness. We love to talk about it. We love to meet the people here. We love Barcelona. So everything's based on feelings, avoiding bad feelings, finding good feelings. You can delay your feelings, your gratification, go to school, get an education, you work, do all that. It may not be that pleasurable because you can get more pleasure in the end. That's what we do, and I think that's what started life. So I don't worry about what anything evolved for. They're all everything evolved to optimize the system to get more pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that's our time.
Okay. Thank you, everybody.